If you want to learn more about the topics of today's episode, visit the podcast website at naturesecretservice.com. Thanks for listening. Okay, people, listen up. Here we go. My name is Ed Newcomer. I'm your host of Nature's Secret Service, the podcast that puts you in the room with the men and women of wildlife law enforcement. Today, our guest is Steve Furr, joining us from his home in Washington State. Steve was a special agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, originally stationed in Sacramento, California, but later transferred to a single agent station up in Olympia, Washington. He served many years as not just a special agent, but also as a regional and national firearms instructor for the service, which is a great help to all of us agents. And he was the recipient of the very prestigious Guy Bradley Award in, I believe, 2017, right, Steve? Nodding.
That's correct.
The Guy Bradley Award is a recognition of a long career of outstanding service and is named after Guy Bradley, who was the first wildlife officer killed in the line of duty back in 1905. Prior to becoming a Fish and Wildlife Service special agent, Steve served as a wildlife officer for the state of Washington for many years. So I'm super happy to have Steve here. Steve and I worked together in the same region for a number of years, and we know each other quite well. But Steve, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's good to be here.
You're looking good. You know, you and I both worked in what was known as Region 1 at the time, which included California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Hawaii, and all of the Pacific Islands. And we always had such a great such great camaraderie among all of the agents in that region. And I think part of that is because throughout that region, there were a lot of similarities in some of the cases we did, or at least in terms of kind of the high profile of the West Coast in terms of the overall Fish and Wildlife Service mission with regard to law enforcement. So we were always kind of under the same or we were on the same hot plate in terms of there was a lot of attention on the cases that were handled on the West Coast.
Yeah.
I don't know if I think you and I share a mutual acquaintance, wildlife officer up in the state of Washington named Greg Haw. And
Yep.
Greg said something to me once that really struck me, because I always knew Greg as a very hard-charging, uniformed wildlife officer. He was always out there chasing poachers in the middle of the night, working his butt off on weekends and holidays. But he said something to me once that really struck me, and he said, if I could do my career over again and start over, I would have focused a lot more time on habitat cases. And that, I agreed with that from my perspective as an agent. I wish I would have. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as a new agent starting out, you're looking for direction on, what to do, right? I mean, what's important? What do they want me to do? And as you know, we had priorities that were spelled out, in the service manual. And if you ever cracked it open and read it, the number one priority was endangered species habitat destruction. So, but they're very unattractive cases. They're always political. Nobody likes doing them. Try selling one of those to a U.S. attorney, right? Yeah. There's just all kinds of problems with them. So it was always ironic to me that, it was, this thing first mentioned on levels of priority, but very few of them ever got done, right? I mean, I think you'd agree with me. I mean, there's really just probably been a handful of criminal cases over the years, that have been done on habitat destruction of, endangered species habitat. So
yeah, that is true. And in fact, on my way over here to the studio today, I went online and I looked at the Office of Law Enforcement webpage for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I looked for the priorities. And even right now, the priorities for the Office of Law Enforcement, number one, I'll read it to you. I got it here on my phone. It says number one priority is unlawful commercial activities and or activities involving habitat destruction affecting wild populations of fish, wildlife, or plants listed as endangered or threatened. That's like the number one priority for the Office of Law Enforcement. And yet you're right. I mean, you hardly ever hear about those cases. I think in my whole 20-year career, I worked on less than half a dozen for sure. And of those, I think maybe one of them got prosecuted. And they're complicated to work. They're complicated to explain to a prosecutor or a jury. They are rife with political landmines, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they can be very controversial because a lot of times they interfere with, quote unquote, private land ownership use and things like that.
Yep, development and how often do you have bodies, right?
Oh, yes.
So that's a key. Most of the time, you're just relying on science and that, these species were there or this is the type of habitat. And, I was lucky on a few of them that it was well documented that, the species was there, and that was really key because, try going to assistant U.S. attorney with, we think they're there, I mean, the habitat looks good. So, believe us, they're there. And they're just not going to buy that. It's just not clean enough,
Right. And that's where this relationship between the law enforcement side, the agent, and the ecological services side of the Fish and Wildlife Service, where the biologists are, is so critical because, so often they're not even in the same offices most of the time. They're separate offices,
right?
And they don't communicate very well and very often. And so the biologists, they really have no idea what the agent's going to need when they show up on a habitat destruction case. And if that documentation has been done before, that these animals are there, they were there, and they are there, and they were there up until this land was destroyed, then you have a much better shot at making a case. But if that documentation is not there, it's going to, a prosecutor's just going to see reasonable doubt everywhere, right?
And the service doesn't have the resources to, document every available habitat for all these species. They never will. That just would be a massive undertaking. And some of the hot spots for these species, they have good data and they know where they are and they've detected them there for years and years. But, a lot of times it's just not there. And there's managers in those offices with those biologists that are leery of getting their people involved in these cases. They know it's going to be a time sucker, right? It's going to just take them away from their duties, and you're going to own them for a while because they might need to write you a take statement or be out there in the field with you, and so there's just problem after problem with these. They're not easy, and you really have to have some resolve to push one of these things through.
Yeah, 100%. I have two stories on that really quick. One was, when I was an agent in Southern California, we used to try to go up to the Ecological Services office, or at least talk to them on a Zoom call or something, and do some training for them on what is it that you need to show to make a criminal case. If a criminal case is ever, in play, the biologists need to know what they need to document and how in order to set the agent up for success, right?
Right.
And then the other one is, to your point about, selling a case to a prosecutor. Agent Aaron Dean and I once worked really hard on a habitat destruction case that involved San Diego fairy shrimp, which are endangered. But, they're a tiny little animal that you're not going to find a body, right?
Yeah, right.
But we actually put together a great case. We actually got a confession from the person who destroyed the habitat, and they admitted that they knew that there were fairy shrimp there.
Yeah.
Took it to a prosecutor with a confession in hand, and we walked into the prosecutor's office, and the first words out of his mouth were, "So what is this, some sort of little mud bug that you were dealing with?" And that just set the whole attitude for the case, and he never prosecuted it. Even with a confession in hand, he would not file charges on that case because it wasn't sexy enough, you know?
Well, and they're misdemeanors, right?
Exactly.
That's the other thing.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you find a false document or obstruction or something like that, it's just, it's a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
And, they're busy, right? These aren't, something they're dying to. So, a lot of times, the service wanted us to go civil.
Mm-hmm.
But, we really didn't have a good civil process.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't strong in the service, and if we had a real strong civil process, it might have been more attractive because you're going to do all this work like it's a criminal case anyway.
Yeah. I almost never tried to push anything civil because from my perspective, because the Endangered Species Act maximum penalty is only a Class A misdemeanor, I at least wanted that criminal conviction on the defendant's record, right? Because the punishment for criminal versus civil wasn't going to be that different. It was mainly going to be money.
Right. It was going to
be money. So, but I wanted that criminal conviction on their record. So I very rarely went, if I was going to put in the time that you and I are talking about, I went criminal always. And if you couldn't make that, just forget about it. But, when I talk to the public, whenever I talk to, I'm sure this is true for you too, and you tell them that the maximum penalty under the Endangered Species Act is a Class A misdemeanor. Maximum time in jail is 1 year, and what is that, $100,000 fine, I think? That's, it's shocking. You kill the last tiger in the world, and the maximum penalty would be 1 year in jail.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, we could go on about that all day. I want to talk to you about a particular area in the Sacramento district where you worked when you were an agent there in Sacramento, called the Suisun Marsh. Can you tell us about that? What is it? Where is it?
Yeah, the Suisun Marsh. So I started out in Sacramento. I worked a year there in a RAC office, resident agent in charge. And after that year in the Sacramento office, I decided to take the Burlingame office, which was over in the Bay Area, near the airport there in South San Francisco. And so that was, part of the area I worked was the Suisun Marsh. It was, it's known as the largest, brackish water marsh on the West Coast. Most of it has been diked off to tidal flow, originally for grazing and agriculture, but then they turned it into all these duck clubs. And there's literally like 158 duck clubs that are part of the Suisun Marsh. And it's just a bunch of walled off duck ponds to the bay, right, from the bay.
So explain to our listeners who might not be familiar, what is a duck club? What is that for?
Well, a duck club is just usually a group of guys or a family that has gotten together and purchased land. And in the case we're talking about it, they do what they call manage these wetlands. They're called managed wetlands for waterfowl. And they try to raise and lower water levels in order to promote certain types of plants to grow that are conducive to bringing ducks in for hunting.
I see.
And so a lot of this marsh, you got to remember, a lot of this marsh has been diked off for many, many years. And so all the animals and the plants that were associated with a natural marsh, a flowing marsh or a tidal wetlands are, that's been part of the reason there's so many listed species in the San Francisco Bay Area, is because a lot of these tidal wetlands have all been drained, diked, for salt production, agriculture, development, whatever. And so very little of this tidal marsh remains. I have a couple numbers for you.
Yeah.
So if you want to get into that a little bit, but historically there were 60,000 acres of tidal wetlands, and now there's less than 8,000.
Wow. Okay.
So that gives you an idea how little tidal wetlands. And a lot of places like up here in the Northwest, we are breaching levees and bringing the tidal flow back in, mostly for salmon, right? And it's the same thing down there. These are really important areas for juvenile salmon, and they're really trying to breach a lot of these levees and bring them back into tidal marshes.
So there are certain words that I can never pronounce. This marsh's name is one of them. Even
yeah. It's Suisun.
It's spelled funny. So when my brain is, there's certain words I cannot say that I will never say on this podcast because I cannot pronounce them. Suisun Marsh. So tell us what kind of species are there? What this marsh is important to what species?
Yeah, there's a number of listed species. A number of fish, the Delta smelt that's been in the news lately, that's an important one that's just tanked. Right. There's, green sturgeon, there's Chinook salmon, California clapper rail, salt marsh harvest mouse, a couple of plants, California least tern. I mean, I can go on and on. I mean, I think I've probably covered 3/4 of them, but there's probably some I'm missing. So because these are all species that depend on tidal marshes, they've all just really tanked over the years. And
you say listed, you're talking about listed under the Endangered Species Act, like the smelt and the clapper rail for sure.
Yeah, endangered or threatened, one of the two. And, California clapper rails, they used to market hunt those things, I mean, around the turn of the century. I mean, they were going to restaurants in San Francisco. There were, those kinds of numbers. And some of the stuff I've looked up lately, I mean, they think there's 1,200 of them left.
Yeah. See, and that fits perfectly with that number one highest priority for the Office of Law Enforcement. You've got habitat where critically endangered species are living, and that's a high priority.
Yeah.
So you're given that it's a high priority. You arrive in this new duty station. You're under the Sacramento RAC district, but you're there in Burlingame. What? Tell us how'd you get involved with the marsh? What happened?
Well, there's some duck hunting that goes on there. It's not like it used to be in the 70s. And a lot of that is because the ducks have shifted, to all the rice in the Central Valley. Right. And so these guys that own these clubs, they're really scratching all the time to try to make things better, and so originally my partner and I at the time, Todd, we started going out and looking at the marsh, just trying to get an idea of, who's who in the zoo, right? And what kind of practices are going on there. And at that point, the way the federal baiting regulations were structured is you couldn't mow anything that had a seed on it. It was just prohibited, so all your mowing you had to do before any kind of seed production, even if it was a native plant, happened with the plant. So there was a lot of mowing going on in the marsh, and we weren't looking at it as a huge deal, but we were trying to get our handle around what was going on out there, and if there were guys baiting with outside crops, right. and that kinds of stuff. And we really weren't even focused, or I wasn't at the time, on endangered species issues because I just newly arrived, right. Really didn't know what was happening. So my RAC at the time, the resident agent in charge, he gave me a list of some names of some people to go talk to that, would give me some intel on possibly, who the poachers were, what kinds of bad things were going on. And of course, I had port duties too,
Right.
with import export, but this was kind of my recreational activity on weekends. And I'm a hunter, as you know, big duck hunter. So I love the marsh.
Right.
And so one of the people he had top of the list was the executive director for the Suisun Resource Conservation District, which was, like a water district that was in charge of the Suisun Marsh and all the duck clubs. And they were the ones that consulted with the Corps and got the Corps permit for all the activities that they want to do in the marsh.
That's the Army Corps of Engineers, right? That controls how those dikes work and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so lots of regulations, as you can imagine. Yeah. So SRCD was formed, Suisun Resource Conservation District, is to deal with all the permitting, deal with the 158 duck clubs. Right. Cal Fish and Game has a huge presence there. They have a big wildlife area, Grizzly Island Wildlife Area. Okay. And so SRCD had, a small staff, biologist, and then this executive director that I was, ended up wanting to meet with,
He's introduced to you as a possible, source of great information about what's going on, right?
Absolutely. Like, he's gonna, I'm gonna find out all about, all the bad guys doing bad things in the marsh. Right. So we set up an appointment with this individual, and I'm gonna keep his name out of it because there's no reason at this point.
He's deceased. We can talk about him.
Yeah. So anyway, we decided to go out there, and they actually share, a building out on the Cal Fish and Game Wildlife Headquarters. There's buildings out there and shops and everything, and we meet with him out in his office. And we start chit-chatting about one thing or the other, and I can tell right away I'm like, so this is my boss's, good source of information, because you're getting the body language automatically, right? That he is not happy with these feds, and he just, he is like, what are these guys up to? Right. A couple of young bucks, And
you're out there.
So we start talking.
You're out there with your partner, Todd Eckhart, right?
Yep. We're out there with Todd. And so we start talking about, marsh practices and who's doing what. And he starts telling us, well, we need to mow out there because, it's really important for water circulation when we flood these ponds, if there's vegetation in the way. Well, prior to that, Todd and I had been out in the marsh, and we witnessed this one individual going out with a tractor with a brush hog, a big mower on it. And all he was doing is going from one patch of nut grass to the other, which was this naturally occurring, it's called alkali bulrush or nut grass. Okay. And he was going from one big patch to the next, mowing and spreading the seed that this stuff produces, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remember the conversation. So I kind of called bullshit on what he was saying there. I think I said something along the lines of, well, we were watching this guy mow, and it looked like all he was doing, it was going from one patch of nut grass to the other, spreading seed before he flooded it.
Right. Which would be, as you described earlier, that essentially is baiting that field to draw ducks in, right?
Yeah, it was back in the day, right? Before they changed the regs, So.
And we had one of my previous guests in an earlier episode was Cash Schriefer, who worked in Louisiana. He talked a lot about the baiting regulations and why it's illegal. So hopefully people have listened to that episode. They know what baiting is and why it's not legal when you're hunting ducks. But anyway, okay, so you're challenging this guy's statement about the importance of mowing.
Yeah. And it's important to know that regs have changed. So, native plants, you can do that. But when we were having this discussion, it was still against the regulations, right? And so, we weren't there to make a huge deal out of it. But, as agents, you got to call bullshit on bullshit, right? And so I just mentioned this to him, that what we'd seen. And the guy just got beat red in the face. And I mean, this is the executive director of a government entity, right? And we're on Cal Fish and Game. I'm kind of thinking we're going to form a relationship of some sort here, and it's going to be good. He turned beet red, stood up at on his desk, or humped over his desk there, looked me right in the eye, came closer, looked me in the eye, and he says, "I'm going to do everything I can to get your ass out of this marsh." This is our first meeting. We're only into this thing 10 minutes, And so I just said, "Well, I guess we're done here," and Todd's over, just shaking his head, and we just walked out and said, "Wow, that was something." What have we kicked over
exactly
here? You know what I mean?
Yep. And, in the detective business, when you run into somebody with that kind of attitude, kind of gives you a clue that there might be some illegal activity afoot, right?
Yeah. And, in hindsight, when we go through the rest of the story, you can see why this guy did what he did.
Right.
I mean, he was in charge of everything. Suddenly, here come a couple of feds. He knows endangered species are at the top of our list of priorities. At the time, it really didn't even occur to me. I thought this was just like, stay out of our duck clubs,
Right.
and, we don't want to be worked by you. We're on a state facility. We don't need you out here checking us.
Right. So this is interesting too, because in his role, anytime there's an endangered species and in a habitat, there has to be what's called a habitat conservation plan, or an HCP, right?
Yeah.
And this guy, in his role, what was his relationship to the HCP there on the marsh?
Well, he's the keeper of the endangered species, right? I mean, he's the one that's negotiating the permit with the Corps of Engineers for what they can and can't do. He's supposed to be the enforcer, right? Because he signed the Corps permit that allowed everything to happen on that marsh.
So
what dredging was allowed to happen, and a whole host of activities out there.
So pretty intimately familiar with what animals are there and what the rules are. Yeah.
That's all they do. That's all they do. So great knowledge,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to get, great. It doesn't get any better than that.
It doesn't. So after that meeting, now you're your focus is even maybe more on the marsh. What happens next after that, after the meeting?
Well, what really, so Todd and I, we went out and made some, there was an agent up north in Chico who used to work that area. Okay. And who I'm talking about there. He was involved in one of your cases prior to you being involved.
I think John Mendoza. Yeah. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so John had some really good contacts there, and he was feeding us information on, some good over limits that were happening out there in the marsh. And I think I'll just tell this story real quick because it's a small group, right? Everybody knows each other. So when somebody gets pinched for an over limit, right, it's gonna spread like wildfire. Right. Yeah, and Todd and I sat on an individual, and the information was right on. He's out shooting double limits every day. That's what he does. He kills 14. The limit was 7. He brings half in, only, at one time, and then goes out and gets the rest of the birds when the coast is clear. Right. So we watched him the better part of a day kill 14 green-winged teal. Okay. And, we came in by boat. These places are real difficult to get into. The government bought me a great 16-foot Lund, and I used to run around those channels, and they couldn't keep you out because there was a lot of channels, and if you knew what you were doing, you could go anywhere.
Right.
And so we came in by boat, watched him kill 14, and what was so amazing to me is he brought his legal limit in. We contacted him where he came into the clubhouse there with 7 birds. We immediately just said, "Hey, we're not going to beat around the bush. Where's the other 7? We've been out here all day watching you." And he just kind of dropped his head and and had me get in the boat with him. I went down the channel back where he came from, where the blind is, and there on this little hummock of ground that was the other 7, that he'd put 100 yards away before he came into the clubhouse dock,
Okay.
And my point on this is he'd been doing this so many years that this hummock of ground was just bare. It was just bare dirt that should have been grass, because this guy had been doing this for God knows how long. And it just took people to go out there and sit all day to catch them. And who's going to do that, right? I mean, it's work. We got up at dark 30, ran a boat, through the dark sloughs. So, we were pretty happy, but that had a effect on the Marsh, right? Pretty soon, all of a sudden, there's 2 feds in there. Yep. They're willing to do this kind of work for an over-limited ducks, right? Yep. And so that just kind of added to it. But what got me into the whole endangered species take situation was there was a flood event in the Marsh. So this marsh is at the confluence of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers. Okay, so they come together right there. Huge amount of water. So as you know, when the California gets rain, they get rain,
especially
right?
up north.
It's usually too much. Yeah, it's usually too much, and it all comes at once. And so there was a huge flood event out there in the Marsh. And again, these are all duck clubs, and there's some nice clubs, and there's some reason to be concerned about flooding, obviously. So the Corps kicked out what was called an emergency permit, right? Because some of the levees were starting to fail, and there was some holes punched in them, and so the Corps kicked out an emergency permit, and that permit said, look, you can go repair the damage, but if there's any endangered species concerns, you need to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service immediately, and then you're going to have to mitigate with them if you end up destroying some habitat. It kind of put the onus on the landowner to get a hold of the service and, fix your problem, but then figure out what to do from there. Right. Well, not all these clubs, but a bunch of the clubs, and of course the main construction company that dealt with all the construction out there, was paid for by the clubs to do the construction. They just went crazy, right? Because they used this as a way to go out and just dredge, right? I mean, because they hadn't had access to the kind of dredging for, forever that they wanted to do to shore up these levees. Right. So I get a call eventually from the Sacramento field office, like, it's gone crazy out there. I mean, they're in all this listed species habitat day after day, doing whatever they want because they want to strengthen all these levees under this emergency permit, even and going way above and beyond what they're supposed to do. So I got called in to the Sacramento office, and essentially my job was to go out and document how much had been done. Right. And so that was going to take up a month or 2 of my time at that point. It was such a huge amount of dredging all over the Marsh. And luckily, they gave me full rein to rent some aircraft. Wow. And a lot of it I did by air. I just flew around and took pictures of all this new levee work and because who was going to do that, right? Who was going to keep these guys accountable for the amount of work that was being done?
Exactly.
Right. And so,
like
and of course,
the biologists who contacted you, they could tell these guys, hey, you're damaging habitat and you've got no mitigation plan, but the biologists can't force them to stop or do anything else, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so really it started out being generated from the Sacramento field office and the biologists that worked out there that knew where all this habitat
Right.
was. They knew the species that were being affected. And so I went out, I started the process of documenting all this.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were looking at it as a civil case, right? Because, when I started the documentation process, I went into the U.S. Attorney's Office in Sacramento, and they weren't interested in anything that occurred under emergency permit,
Ah, okay.
right?
Okay.
They just they just said, "Hey, we know the language is really good as far as endangered species, and they can't do this, and they need to get a hold of the service before, and blah blah blah." But they just weren't going to touch
Right.
it. So,
Right.
that's kind of what happened. But there's a lot more to it, and if you want me to
Yeah.
go on, I'll
Yeah. Go
continue.
on.
Or
So you've documented now all the destruction of the habitat, and now what?
now what? So, um, again, I'm making up these binders. I'm documenting. There's 158 duck clubs. I can't tell you to this day how many were involved in this dredging and this work. There was generally just one construction company that did all the work. A lot of it by barge.
Right.
And so I'm putting together these binders. Well, during the course of this, suddenly there's kind of information trickling in from sources. We're getting calls that, hey, there's a lot more going on, and there's a lot of illegal work going on that's not part of this emergency permit and was done prior to the emergency and is being done well after the emergency permit expires. Okay. So at that, yeah,
You got to go
ahead.
talk to the construction company, right? You're going to go interview those guys.
Well, yeah. Well, and I knew what the answer was going to be. I mean, this is kind of like it's such a closed group, right? I mean, I can't talk to anybody without the beans being spilled. So John up north, the agent in Chico, he said, "Well, if you need help, get a hold of the FBI in Fairfield, California." He goes, "There's an agent there I've worked with before on Endangered Species Act cases. He's a great guy, and he'll help you. He's right there in Fairfield, which is, right there on the Suisun Marsh." And I'm going, okay. So I got a hold of that agent, and we ended up, just becoming really good friends as part of this case and working it together. When I gave him the information on the director of the Suisun Resource Conservation District, he started saying, "Well, this guy's got to be up to no good. And, why is he letting this work happen, when he's supposed to be the gatekeeper, right?" And so he kind of started looking at it as a public corruption case.
Oh, interesting. Because
is he?
We've all worked with the FBI in our careers at different times, but it's typically not on a habitat destruction case.
Yeah, right. So he had a great angle, right? I mean, he had and I was a new agent. I was a fairly new agent, so he was talking to me about things I didn't even think about, like money and where are they getting the money to do this and yada yada yada. And so I got the FBI involved, and then also, since there was illegal dredging going on, EPA is the one that enforces that, for Rivers and Harbors Act is what it's called when you're doing illegal dredging, and violating a Corps permit. So I ended up linking up with an EPA agent in Sacramento, super helpful, right? Was totally into it. It was endangered species. She was just gung ho, and so was this FBI agent.
Nice.
So we kind of started a little task force, and we said, well, if there's dredging outside the emergency permit period, we're going to take these people on a criminal ESA take.
Absolutely.
Because they all have the knowledge. they all are part of this core permit. They all have read it. They've all been mailed copies of it, and we're gonna look into it and see what happens.
Interesting, and that's another thing. EPA is another agency that has law enforcement authority, and they do have special agents that work for the EPA. So that's another agency that we frequently can get involved in, particularly on habitat destruction or pollution cases and that type of thing. Okay, so where does this lead you? So now you're definitely on a criminal track. You've gotten good knowledge. You've documented that there's take outside this emergency plan. In the normal course of this investigation, then where do you go next?
Well, at this point, we're getting some really good informants developed. Okay, they just kind of come out of the woodwork, and we start working with these people closely.
Okay.
Right? They're in the know. They start telling us who's doing what, when it's done, how much damage. It's done outside the emergency period. There's full knowledge.
Right.
And so guess who pops up as one of the main illegal habitat take suspects in the Marsh, but the director of the Suisun Resource Conservation District.
No kidding. So the informants or the sources you've got start to actually point fingers toward this guy.
Yep, said he did a huge dredge in critical habitat for these endangered species, California clapper rail, Delta smelt, took a lot of habitat, way out, had nothing to do with an emergency. And so this is a guy that's telling other club members or club owners, you can't do this on your club. This is, a violation of the permit. So, and you got to remember, this individual, he's tight with Fish and Game. He's got Mucky Mucks from Fish and Game hunting his club from the regional office. I mean, it was pretty intimidating. You knew there were a lot of powerful people that were not going to be happy with the outcome here.
And you're talking about California Department of Fish and Game, which is now California Department of Fish and Wildlife. But so so you've got officials at California Department of Fish and Wildlife who are tight with this guy and actually hunt on his property, huh?
Oh, absolutely. Eesh. Absolutely. Regional managers, that kind of thing. And what they knew, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you couldn't know. Right. I mean, they're doing these huge projects and floodgates and dredge material and things like that. So, but I couldn't talk to them about it. Again, there was very limited people I could talk to in the know. And if it wasn't for these people that came forward at a lot of risk to them career-wise, right? I mean, these are all people that are in the field, right? And they came through and they gave us some really good information, enough that we eventually wrote a number of search warrants and had about 40 agents from FBI, EPA, and Fish and Wildlife descend on two private homes, SRCD headquarters, the construction company headquarters, and seize computers and files and everything to document what was going on.
Yeah, so that's when you do a search warrant like that, what are you looking for? Documents mainly, or what?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these people, this is, transitioning into computers, right? But a lot of these were paper files, that had a duck club's name, and, this is the work that's been done. There was a really interesting twist to this, Ed, and I'm going to bring it up now before I forget about it. It shows you how crazy things get. Well, there's a congressional act called the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, right? And it's NACA. People use the name NACA for this. Well, NACA was a bunch of matching funds to do work on wetlands. And so we have pictures before all this went down in Ducks Unlimited magazine, with our regional director, right, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, standing there with big checks.
Oh.
And the executive director of SRCD, with these standing with these big fake checks, the service basically giving money to these duck clubs to do work on their property,
Which would be habitat restoration work. Supposed to be.
Or whatever,
Yeah,
right?
supposed to be, right?
At one point I was, as you recall, or you brought up earlier, the region was a huge region at the time, and in Sacramento office, I believe they had kind of like a deputy director, somebody that just handled a lot of the California, Nevada issues,
right.
but it was still run out of Portland, but this person was right under the director in Portland.
Okay.
And at one point, my boss asked me to give a briefing to this guy.
Okay.
Because as you'll also remember, we were under a different chain of command back then. The special agent in charge used to report to the director.
Right. Exactly.
In the direct up in Portland.
Yeah, to the regional director. Whereas now law enforcement has what's called line authority. They go directly to the assistant director for law enforcement in Washington, D.C. Back then,
right,
the special agents in charge for the region answered to the non-law enforcement regional directors for this service. So that was a very awkward situation, particularly in cases like you're describing.
Right. So these guys are going down, giving tons of money to these clubs for their managed wetlands down there. Right. And what are they doing with the money, right? What are they doing with these NACA funds? So I was kind of ordered, more or less, because I was really uncomfortable doing it, because it was kind of in the middle of this investigation. And I knew that this deputy manager that was not law enforcement knew all these people I was dealing with at a super high level. Right. And so I went to Sacramento like I was told, and I remember a statement that this guy made. He looked at me at one point during my briefing and said, "For God's sakes, please don't tell me there's any NACA funds being used to destroy endangered species habitat." And I said, "We haven't made that connection, but I guarantee it's happening." Oh boy. Because you're writing these guys checks and they're spending it any way they want, and they're writing their own invoices, and it'd take a dozen agents to ferret through all this. Wow. And so I went to Department of Interior OIG,
Office of Inspector General.
Sacramento. Yeah, in Sacramento at the time, totally uninterested in the case.
Interesting.
Because I thought, hey, this is right down their alley, right? Yeah. I mean, and I couldn't get them interested, to work that angle of it. And like, as you know, things get so time consuming, right? I mean, this would have been a whole nother facet to going through books, more search warrants, bank records, trying to tie in these checks for NACA funds to, what these guys were actually doing on the ground, and whether it was in destroying endangered species habitat.
Right.
So
when you did your search warrants, did you do interviews, and what was the result of those? Did you get anybody to confess or anything?
Yeah. Well, the timing, we did, since we started to have some people on the inside, we actually did the timing. So a couple of the principals were gone, because we wanted, unfettered access to some of the places that we were going. So like the deputy director, the executive director for SRCD, he was gone. He was obviously our main target on this thing, because we knew he was in charge and he'd violated. So he was gone. So we did interview his deputy during the day of the search warrant, and it was a warm day in this little bit of a cramped office building out in the middle of the marsh, and boy, we just worked on them and worked on them and worked on them. And, just sweat was pouring out of this guy's forehead. And finally, after a long interview, I kind of took over part of the way through, and it started out with the FBI agent working on him, and then I took over, and we finally got him to admit, that his boss, the executive director, did a huge illegal dredge in endangered species habitat in the Suisun Marsh.
Nice.
And this is the guy's name that's on the permit, for the Corps of Engineers, that I will not do any of this stuff, and I'm signing. So
pretty good case at that point.
Great knowledge, right? Great. It's just, so at that point, I'm like, well, any prosecutor's going to take this.
Right.
I mean, I really felt like, if this isn't knowledge, I mean, I'm just going to give up doing habitat cases if this isn't good enough.
If this isn't it, then there is no good case, right?
Yeah, there is no good case. I mean, here's the guy that negotiated the permit with the Corps, right?
Okay, so here's the $100,000 question. Were you able to sell it to a prosecutor? Did you get charges out of this case?
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah,
what
we
were
did.
the charges and what was the outcome?
So we ended up charging through information, misdemeanors. We charged the executive director for the Suisun Resource Conservation District. We charged him with a take of endangered species and listed, Delta smelt, California clapper rail, and Chinook salmon as the principal species, because it was all habitat outside the levees, that these animals use. Right. And then we also charged the principal contractor, the construction guy, for the same violation. He was in the loop with everybody. He knew all the permit conditions, and they both pled guilty.
So these were criminal charges under the ESA. Great. And they both pled guilty. Okay, good. Do you remember what the outcome was, what the sentencing?
We asked for jail time. Of course, we didn't get it. I think they both got $10,000 fines, okay. Which, isn't much, particularly for the amount of work that went into this, but it was symbolic, right? I mean, it was really symbolic. It had a huge ripple effect through the marsh. The board of the SRCD, which is made up of, duck club owners, landowners in the marsh, they terminated him immediately, which I gave him high marks for that. Right. And so he lost his job there. Good articles in the newspaper, Sacramento Bee, and the local Fairfield paper, and was pretty easy to find a number of articles on it for quite a while. Yeah. So, again,
I don't know. There's something. This is why I think going the criminal route is so important, because I'm sure some of the people listening or watching will say, didn't go to jail, $10,000, that's nothing. But it really is, because at that point, once they pled and they were sentenced, even though it's a Class A misdemeanor, it is a federal crime on their record, right? Right. They now have a record, and if anybody ever runs them, they come up as a person convicted of a federal crime, and that has consequences in a lot of different avenues of life. And more importantly, when people might say, "Gosh, why did that agent's work was wasted. He spent so much time doing that case and all they got was a misdemeanor with no time." That's not really the right way to look at it. What you did was you proved a ongoing, illegal activity. You got convictions. It's on the record. Any future violations similar, that's where sentences get much harsher in the federal system. The federal system tends to cut people a lot of slack on their first conviction. Second conviction, third conviction, not so much, right? And it can be very, very important to lay that first case down on someone's record, because if they violate again, the penalty's going to be much harsher. They have a much higher chance of going to jail. if they are a second offender. And so, it does have a tremendous deterrent effect, even though it's only a Class A misdemeanor with no jail time in this case, right?
No, I agree. I mean, and as you know, the U.S. Attorney's Office, they put out real tight press releases that, spell everything out, and super easy for the newspapers to pick up and write and it's all facts, right? It's just, this is what happened. This is what this guy did. He's in charge of this. He thumbed his nose at the Endangered Species Act and was, the major violator. Right. And again, I think of the duck clubs that he denied the same activity, right? I mean, they must have been furious because, they're like, what? You're in charge of us and you're violating.
Yeah.
You're the big violator.
Very selective, right?
So yeah. So and I did follow up on, we had a gentleman, an attorney that was working out of Portland for a while, and I can't remember his name. He did follow up on quite a few of the civil cases that happened during the emergency permit.
Nice.
And he got some civil fines from some of the clubs. It was a lot of back and forth negotiation, and they just finally agreed to write a check for X amount. But so that was followed up on, and we did get some justice there too.
Nice. Well, hey, we have about 5 minutes left, and there's a couple things I want to touch on real quick. When you do a case like this, as you mentioned, there were some, high level people at California Department of Fish and Wildlife who were connected in with some of these clubs. You've got some powerful interests that are looking at this. I think it's important for listeners to understand what the fallout is from a case like this, just in terms of you as an agent trying to do your job. So, like, for example, after this happened, tell us, what did it affect your relationship with the state of California Department of Wildlife?
Well, it certainly did with above the warden level. I think the wardens were all kind of, thumbs up, right. Because as the California Fish and Wildlife wardens, top notch, right?
Yep. Very hard workers.
Top notch. I've worked all over the West. I've worked with many state wardens, and Cal Fish and Game at the time, is what their name was. They were top notch. You could trust any of them with anything.
Same. It's true in Southern California as well.
But so I think they were all, thumbs up. Here's a Fed doing his job and doing stuff that needs to be done. But above that, as far as anybody above that, I think it was my name was mud, right? Because I was stirring the pot, Yeah. For sure. In the Napa office, I know they had the same kind of organization back then, where generally somebody that was in charge was a non-law enforcement person. Right. You know what I mean? The regional manager.
How about from the fish and wildlife biologists? How did they react to your case? How'd they view you?
Oh, hero status, right?
Right.
We're not worthy, they were, it was great. That was, that was really nice to have that kind of accolades from those guys. Those men and women, they're great scientists. They work really hard. They produce a lot of incredible information, and they were like, finally somebody's listening.
Exactly. So important. I think one of the best things out of this case was, at the time, the special agent in charge for our region was a guy named Dave McMullen. And you told me that after you finished up this case, he gave you a call and he just had 3 words to say to you. Do you remember what those words were?
Yeah, it was a great case, kid. It was something along those lines. It was just like, he stayed out of it the whole time. I really never heard boo from him, and then I got that call, and, when the final report went in and he read it, and he just said, hey, great case, kid. this is what we want our men and women doing.
Fantastic. That was he was a very inspirational leader, and it doesn't surprise me at all that he said that to you.
Yeah, I was real happy because there was a lot of rocky roads, right? There was, that path was not easy to get to that point.
No, sometimes when you do those habitat cases, you feel like you're really exposed and you're really out there on your own.
Yeah,
I think some of we're going to have an agent on eventually named Sean Mann, and he was doing a habitat case and had a guy draw a gun on him, almost gets in a shootout over a habitat case.
Yeah, I know.
Crazy stuff. That was Northern California as well. Steve, I know we could talk about this all day. There's a lot more to this case.
Oh, we've
got limited time here, but you also have a ton more stories to tell, and I hope you'll come back on the show in future episodes down the road.
I will.
Good,
I will.
Because I will force you to do it, even if you didn't want to. So that'll do it for today's episode of Nature's Secret Service. I want to thank our guest, Steve Furr. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being with us today, and we'll see everybody next time. Nature's Secret Service is written and produced by me, Ed Newcomer, and is co-produced by the DHTV team here at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Follow us on social media and connect with us online at naturesecretservice.com.